So I will be a moderator for our today meeting, and probably we will start. Professor Reichardt, the floor is yours, so we are happy to start.
Great. Thank you very much, Alina. And I would like to welcome everybody to this lectures. And I will try to speak very clearly, slowly. If you have any questions during the lecture, you can stop me and you can ask the questions, or you can wait until after the lecture if you have questions. That's fine. So I'm going to try to share now the PowerPoint with you, and I hope it works. So we'll try this, and let me find it here. Okay, start sharing.
Yes, everything is okay. It works.
Okay, and I'm going to, I think, I'll switch off my camera just during the lecture so that we can focus more on the lecture.
Okay.
And let's see, I have to now, I have to also see the lecture. You can see the lecture, I don't see the lecture.
You must switch on slideshow.
Yes, switch on slideshow. Thank you so much for that.
And from beginning, yes.
Okay, now is okay? Yeah, do you see that? Peculiarities?
Yes, we can see, and you?
Yes, now I see.
For you? Okay.
Now I see my lecture also. That's fine, thank you. And this first lecture I put in English and Ukraine language. I apologize for the translation if it's not perfect, because I kind of use Google Translator, but I hope it's enough that can help a little bit to explain. Okay, so we'll begin now this lecture. And again, peculiarities of the political and economic design of Europe after Second World War. Go to next slide here. I can change that. Okay, I want to say this lecture discusses the interesting aspects of European integration from the end of World War I and World War II until 1993, the beginning of the European Union. So I will take the history up to 1993 with special focus on after World War I and before World War II. So a special focus at the beginning of the European integration process. Now, prior to the 20th century, there were many attempts to unite Europe. And I'm sure your Professor Ilova has talked to you about that, or she will. But none of the proposals for uniting Europe had a really long-lasting or concrete effect. So the question was why? Why these earlier proposals before World War I, they didn't really have a strong effect in uniting Europe like we have a united Europe today with the European Union? Why it didn't happen generations earlier? Good question. Well, one answer is that most of the earlier proposals for European integration, for example, you can go back to 18th century Immanuel Kant, big idealist philosopher and writer. Most of these people were not politicians or statesmen. They were more philosophers or writers. So there was no strong political motivation or political will to actually make united Europe, a European integration, a reality. And so that's one explanation, that there were not many politicians or statesmen who were truly motivated to make a united Europe. Until World War I, something changed with World War I, starting in 1914, finished in 1918. It was called the War to End All Wars because it was so horrible. Maybe you studied the history of World War I. It was really terrible. Something between, you know, I don't know, the statistics, sometimes 10 million killed, 12 million, up to 15 million killed, depending on the statistics that you read. But it was truly a horror for Europe, as you know, World War I. And so World War I motivated a treaty, as you probably know, the famous Treaty of Versailles after World War I in Versailles, France, in around 1920. And it motivated Woodrow Wilson and the other participants to formulate 14 points. And 2 of the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson were national self-determination and the League of Nations. Well, national self-determination, it was the idea that nations or people that have national consciousness, such as, for example, Czech people or Hungarian people, should have their own country, should have their own state. They should not be in a multinational empire like the Habsburg Empire or the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire. They should have their own country. So that was called national self-determination. That's one of the 14 points of the Versailles Treaty. And the other was the making a League of Nations, that is, the countries around the world would join an international organization to make peace in the world, so there will never again be a world war. Yeah, peace and security in the world. This is the very first time they made it with League of Nations. Both of these were proposed by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, and both of them were accepted in the Treaty of Versailles. So this is going to be important for European integration also, and I will explain in just a few seconds here. Now, in the 1920s, there was also cooperation within European countries in Central Europe. For example, in 1922, there was a Benelux cooperation, where the countries of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, little countries between France and Germany, got together and they created a free trade area, you know, and they started to cooperate in their economics, and we call that the Benelux cooperation. So what you can see here in the 1920s, we had the Versailles Treaty with a global cooperation, and now we have regional cooperation in Europe in 1920s. All of this because of World War I, because you know, the horror of the World War I. We don't want to go to war. We want to cooperate. 1923, there was a movement started in Europe called the Pan-Europa movement. This was sponsored by a very famous person in European history, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. Coudenhove-Kalergi was an Austrian diplomat and thinker, philosopher, and he started a movement, the Pan-Europa movement, across Europe to try to unite Europe, to bring the countries together in some type of an organization. So he proposed kind of a very early form of European integration, European Union. That was Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. And in 1930, Aristide Briand, the former French prime minister and former French foreign minister, he proposed the Briand Memorandum. Aristide Briand was part of Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europa movement. He was a member of that. And so as a practical politician, he had the authority to actually make a formal proposal on the part of France. And what was interesting about his proposal for European integration, it was very similar to the European Union we have today. He believed, and in fact, I believe he is the first person to use the phrase European Union. I think that was Aristide Briand that made that phrase that we have today. And so he proposed an integration of European countries, and it would be around economics, free trade, and customs union. And he proposed that it would be part of the League of Nations. It would actually be in the League of Nations system, this international organizational system. That was interesting. It would be, for example, students, if the European Union today were part of the OSN, the United Nations, like a component part of the United Nations, that would be similar to what Aristide Briand recommended. Yeah. So that was his recommendation, European integration along the lines of what the Pan-Europa movement proposed. This is a picture here of Coudenhove-Kalergi with his Pan-Europa idea, this idea of a European federation or integration. And that, according to Coudenhove-Kalergi, would be a conference of European leaders, a customs union. Customs union is a protective tariff around your free trade area. We'll talk about that later, customs union. And a European constitution, yes, for this European Union, a constitution which we have today. I'll talk about that later. And you know, it's interesting, he wanted English as the common language, which more or less is the reality today of the European Union. English is now, there are 24 official languages of the European Union, 24 official languages. But what language do they speak the most? Is English. And so that is kind of de facto the common language of the European Union. But this was all from this guy, Count Coudenhove-Kalergi. So you can Google him, read about him on Wikipedia. Very interesting individual, Pan-Europa movement. Now this is Aristide Briand, a photo there at the bottom. And again, he proposed the creation of a European confederation of countries that would work within the League of Nations. And it would be a common market, yeah, single market. What did it mean? The free trade area, huh? Economic free trade. A European transport network, yeah, which they have today. They're developing that now. Regional and social policies, very similar to the European Union we have today. That was Aristide Briand. Amazing. Mm-hmm. So very, very progressive. And so students, once again, this is the 1920s and early 1930s. And this is in reaction to World War I, this horrible conflict in Europe with countries fighting each other, with many, many people killed. And so there was this search for a new way to cooperate together. How can we keep the peace in Europe? So this was the idea in the 1920s, integrate Europe. But these great 1920s integration proposals really failed because of the 1930s challenges. Yeah, so what happens in the 1930s is going to cause these great proposals to fail, to fall down. Yeah. So what happens? Let's talk about that now. The problem with these proposals. First of all, as you know from your history, in the 1930s, there's a worldwide economic depression. Yeah, this was worldwide. And what happens when you have economic depression? Maybe some of you study economics, macroeconomic, huh? The countries typically go inside themselves. They don't look to cooperate with other countries. They focus on their own economic crisis. And they raise the tariffs on their borders, against goods from other countries. So the cooperation finishes. with economic depression, especially in a very, very bad economic depression, which was 1930s. And then there was the security threats in Europe and around the world. Remember, in 1931, Japan attacks Manchuria, China, and expanding in Asia, Japan. 1935, Italy goes into Ethiopia. 1936, Germany under Hitler goes into Rhineland. Then in 1938 in Austria, and 1939 in Czechoslovakia. So what happens when you have security threats? Countries begin to kind of focus on themselves and their security needs, and not always cooperating together. They're afraid. They're afraid. And so what do we have then coming? Well, we have World War II. World War II. Now, students, World War II magnified the killing of World War I by 3 or 4 times. Can you imagine that? So we're talking about 30 million, some people say up to 50 million people killed in World War II. Remember, World War I was the war to end all wars. Well, now World War II is magnifying World War I by 3 or 4 times. So World War II renews the interest in the idea of international cooperation, because World War II showed 2 things. There were 2 lessons from World War II. First, a realistic system of international relations. For example, balancing the power, states balancing each other. Like, you have so many soldiers, I have so many soldiers. You have so many cannons, I have so many cannons. You have so many tanks, we have so many tanks. This balancing, it can't really work to keep the peace. Because what happens when there's no balance? When one country has more soldiers or more cannons or more tanks than another country, then there's no balance, and there can be war. And number 2, an idealistic system of international relations, like the League of Nations, right? The League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's idea, very idealistic. It won't work if there's no force or power behind it. And students, if you study the League of Nations, it was really helpless. It did not help to stop Hitler in Europe in the 1930s. It had no real power behind it. We can talk about later about why that was. There's explanation, but the reality was, objectively, it had very little power to stop aggressive countries like Germany in the 1930s. So the post-World War II solution to this problem of conflict and war was to build an idealistic global community. Okay, we're going to do it again, a new League of Nations, but this time it's going to have power to keep the peace. And we're going to make a global economic system for global economic stability, so that countries cooperate in their economics. They don't look internally, but they look externally to cooperate economically with their neighbors and other countries. Okay? What did they do? They made a new League of Nations, and they called it the United Nations. This was the phrase of President Franklin Roosevelt, the American president. He named this organization. Now, why did they change the name? Why didn't they use the name League of Nations again? Well, that name had a very bad feeling because it failed. It was not successful. So they wanted a new start, a new name, with a new organization, and the headquarters is going to be New York City. And that shows the Americans with power of America is going to guarantee this new organization, okay? Remember that the League of Nations, the headquarters was in Switzerland. Well, Switzerland is not exactly a very powerful country, a very powerful image, yeah? When we think of Switzerland, we think of chocolate, beautiful nature, yeah, these things, but not really power. So they changed the location from Geneva, Switzerland to New York City. And the organization begins in 1945. Now, what about a global economic system? Well, they made it also. And they made it with the name the Bretton Woods economic system. Now, why Bretton Woods? Bretton Woods is a little town in New Hampshire, United States. New Hampshire is one of the states of USA. And there's a little town there, you can go there, Bretton Woods, and that is where in 1944, before the end of World War II, 44 countries, plus the United States, came to a meeting in this little town, and they discussed the plans for post-war global economy and focused on free trade. You know what free trade is, right? No trade barriers on the border, no tariffs. Goods can go from country to country with no strong barriers. Stable exchange rates, yeah. That means the dollar rate and the currency of other countries would be stabilized. And then rebuilding Europe's economies. That was all part of this Bretton Woods Agreement. And the Bretton Woods Agreement, it's lasted until, well, some people say till today. Many parts of it are still active today. We can talk about that. Some parts not, but many parts are. Today, the students today, you know what the Bretton Woods economic system is today? It's the World Trade Organization. That's basically what it is, the WTO. So, that's the ancestor, or that's the grandson of the Bretton Woods economic system that was created in 1944. Now, the movement to start cooperation internationally also motivated cooperation regionally in Europe. So now we're coming to Europe, okay? So we have this big push for international cooperation, but now we're going to have a push for European cooperation, also after World War II. And so the new post-war European governments, at the time, this is 1945, they really were not focused initially at the beginning on cooperation. Why? Because the countries of Europe were so destroyed by World War II. Again, they focused internally on reconstructing their countries. So at the very beginning, like let's say 1945, 46, there's kind of low priority in Europe to regional cooperation because of the terrible, terrible destruction, the chaos in Europe, in Central Europe. After the Second World War, there were many, many problems. Let's look at these problems in these European countries. Okay, we can go country by country here. France. Well, France was destabilized. It was a wartime collaborator. Very often we talk about the French resistance, resistance to the Nazis. But as you probably know, there was, of course, French resistance, but a large part of France cooperated with the fascists, and they created a fascistic France, the Vichy France. So France was actually divided. It was part of France was fascistic, Vichy, and part of France during the war was occupied by the Nazis, by the German National Socialists. So after the war, we have a new government, the Fourth Republic, but it's very weak because France was really destroyed during the war. And because France is so weak, they lose their colonies. For example, in 1954, they lost Indochina. What is Indochina? Vietnam. Vietnam. This is why the Americans came to Vietnam. They replaced the French, who lost the war in Vietnam. So the Americans went in to try to make a free Vietnam. And then the Americans had trouble, as you know. Well, France is worried. Their main worry is about Germany coming again, because there was World War I, World War II, and they are worried about Germany in a World War III. So that's what France is worried about. What about Germany? Germany is really destroyed. The cities were bombed, as you know. Cities like Hamburg, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Köln, Dresden, completely destroyed. Germany is introverted. It's ashamed of the history of the Holocaust. And it has the objective to rebuild its alliance with the West. That means with France, with the Americans, the new Germany, to create a new democratic Germany. Okay, that's the objective now of this Germany. Of course, Germany is divided, and the eastern part of Germany goes under the communists of the Soviet Union. Okay, so we're talking here more about the Western Germany. Austria. Austria is divided into occupation zones, like Germany was also. What are the four zones? Well, you have the American zone, you have the Soviet Union zone, you have the British and the French zones. It is very similar to Germany. Austria was seen as a victim of Germany, which was kind of really not true, because if you know the history, Austria really participated very positively in the fascistic Germany. But at the end of the war, they were seen as a victim because they were small. They go back to their democratic constitution of 1920. Italy is introverted. It is also treated as a victim of Germany, which was completely not true, because the fascists started really with Mussolini in Italy, as you know, in the 1920s. It had many problems stabilizing its post-war democratic governments, and it still has some of this political instability problem. And too many political parties in Italy make it very difficult to have stable coalitions. That's still a problem today. Oh, by the way, why were Austria and Italy treated as victims of Hitler and the Germans? That's a good question. It was because of the Cold War. The Cold War was beginning with the Soviet Union, and the Americans, they wanted Austria and Italy. They wanted their cooperation. And so they were easy with Austria and Italy. They were treated more as victims of Germany and not as full supporters, which they were. Okay. The United Kingdom, it came out of the war with high prestige, maybe the highest prestige of all European countries. It was more stable than France or Germany, but still economically weak. Exports were cut by 2/3, and national wealth by 75%. The voters elected a Labour government in 1945. They turned inward also, and they lost their colony of India because of their economic weakness. Yeah, that's when India got independence, yeah, right after the war. What about Ireland? Well, Ireland was neutral during the war, but it was economically connected to the United Kingdom, or I should say Britain. Still relatively poor. Even today, it's relatively poor in the European Union. Greece, poor, unstable. They had a military dictatorship from 1967 to 74. Portugal and Spain, poor, dictatorship. Portugal was under Antonio Salazar, and Spain was under Francisco Franco until 1975. Yeah, interesting that all the way until the 70s, Greece and Portugal and Spain had dictators, yeah, in more this fascistic style. What about the little Benelux countries? Well, the little Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, they were occupied by Germany during the war, and they agreed to a post-war cooperation. You know, students, in the history of European integration, like, for example, remember after World War I in 1922, we have the Benelux cooperation. Now, after World War II, we again have a Benelux cooperation. It's always the Benelux that start European cooperation. Why? Well, they're little countries and they're in a sandwich. You know, think of a cheeseburger or a hamburger between France and Germany. What a terrible location, right? Between France and Germany, you have little countries and they are in the sandwich. And so they have a good motivation for European cooperation. So they usually start the process. And that starts in 1948 with the Benelux Customs Union. What is a customs union? Well, remember, first you make a free trade area. No tariffs on your border. That means goods can go from one country to another country with no expense, no costs. Yeah. For example, if I send a package from the United States, I'm American, right? I live in Slovakia. If I send a package, or my sister in America, she sends me a package to Slovakia, it comes to the Slovakia Customs Post Office, yeah, Customs, the Solnica, they call it here Solnica, yeah? And they open the package, and if it is more than, I don't know, $20, $50, I have to pay tax, a tariff for that, yeah? But if it's coming from Germany to Slovakia, or from Spain or Portugal or another European country, no tax, no tariff. It just goes across the border and without cost. Now, a customs union then is protecting the union with a tariff on the larger border. So around the whole European Union today, you have a customs tariff, so that when goods come from Ukraine, from America, from Japan, from Nigeria, Argentina, they have to pay at that border of the European Union. That's a customs union. So free trade area within the union, and then tariff barrier around the union. That's a customs union, okay? And then in 1958, about 10 years later, the Benelux countries make an economic union in which they integrate their monetary system so that they have one basic value of their currencies, okay? What about the Nordic countries? Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden. Well, you know, students, these are very small countries with population. They have very homogeneous population. That is, they don't have many minority groups. They're relatively wealthy countries, rich, and they have fewer social problems. Now, that changed today, right? Because a lot of immigrants go there. But certainly at this time, it was true. In 1946, they get together, they start cooperating with legislative cooperation. They unify their legal systems, yeah? In 1952, they create the Nordic Council to promote the abolition, the canceling of passport controls, free movement of workers can be, and joint ventures with businesses can make projects together without any bureaucracy. Huh? So this is So really you have two groups of countries that start cooperating. The Benelux, they start a cooperation, and the Nordic states, they begin. Again, the Nordic states, they speak a similar language. It's not completely similar, and they have similar cultures. So it's a little bit easier for them to cooperate. What about America? Well, the United States was at first not interested in remaining in Europe. There was a huge American army demobilization in Europe after the Second World War. Remember, students, at the end of the Second World War, there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in Europe. And they were staying in Europe at the end of the war, but they were going to go home. They said, okay, we finished, it's finished. Germany is now, has capitulated, they surrendered. Now we can go home. Yeah, the job is finished. I put here, the United States assumed that Europe could recover alone, that they didn't need the United States anymore. We can go home now. That was the thinking at the end of the Second World War from the American side. But what happens? The Cold War begins, and it changes everything. What is the Cold War? The Cold War was the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, between the US presidential administration and the administration of Joseph Stalin, yeah, in the Soviet Union. And students, it begins really early after the Second World War. Already in 1946, we have the Iran crisis. Now, I know we have an Iran crisis today. Seems we always have an Iran crisis. But this was one of the first ones. And what was this? Well, you know, during the Second World War, the Soviet Union occupied northern Iran. And the British, as far as I remember, they occupied the southern part of Iran. I could be wrong about that, but they occupied different parts of Iran. And there was an agreement made at the United Nations, one of the first meetings of the United Nations. They agreed that the Soviet Union would go out of Iran and the British would go out of Iran, and Iran would be one country again. Well, what happened? The British, they went out according to the agreement, but not the Soviet Union. Stalin and the Soviets, they stayed in Iran, which made the crisis, yeah? In 1947, there was a Greek and Turkish crisis. What was that? Well, there was a real worry that the Greek communists and the Turkish communist part, they were going to take control of Greece and Turkey. And they were doing it with money and support from Moscow. That the communists in Greece and Turkey were going to win. And so the Americans said, oh no, oh no. And the Americans began to push against that by supporting the opposition, the opponents in Greece and Turkey. In 1948, then we have the Berlin crisis. And the Berlin crisis was the big one, where the Soviet Union closed the city of Berlin to the Western allies, the United States, the British, and the French. Now, remember, at the end of the Second World War, there was an agreement about Berlin. Berlin was divided into 4 sectors, just like Germany and just like Austria. It was 4 sectors in Berlin. There was a Soviet sector, an American sector, British, and French. Yeah. Well, the Soviets, they blocked access, the way into Berlin on the border of East Germany, what becomes East Germany later. Yeah, they blocked that so that the Americans and the British and the French could not get into Berlin. And that started the so-called Berlin. And that was the big one. So you can see here this comic. This is actually later. This is Kennedy and Khrushchev. But it symbolizes this growing stress between the United States and Soviet Union. Oh, what is the American response? Number one, the United States is going to stay in Europe with the military and political presence. U.S. will stay. Now, this is President Truman, the guy after Roosevelt, and he says, we're going to stay in Europe. Number two, the Americans propose a plan to aid Europe, the Marshall Plan. Students, this was big, big money in 1947, 48, 12.5 billion US dollars. Now, today, that would be many hundreds of billion dollars to aid Europe. Yeah, and then finally, the OEEC. This was an organization created by the Americans and the Europeans together to motivate European countries to cooperate in spending the Marshall Plan money. So the Americans said, okay, European countries, we have this money for you, but if you want the money, you must join the OEEC. What is it? The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the Organization of European Economic Cooperation. How to spend the money. European countries, you must cooperate to have the money if you want the money. So, European cooperation opinions. Yeah. Let's look at some opinions here of this new cooperation. Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was a confederalist. Yeah. He called for a United States of Europe. And I think he was, he liked this phrase, United States of Europe. He did not develop the phrase. The phrase United States of Europe actually comes from a Frenchman, Victor Hugo. Maybe you remember Victor Hugo, a famous writer. He wrote Les Miserables and some other famous works in French. But, Victor Hugo, he loved the United States of America. And he imagined a United States of Europe. And so Winston Churchill, he uses this phrase from Victor Hugo. Let's make a United States of Europe with a Council of Europe, kind of ministers to keep the regional political and economic stability in Europe. Now, students, please remember, Winston Churchill is not a federalist. He doesn't want a federal Europe. He doesn't want a super state in Europe, but a confederal Europe, a cooperating group of countries in a confederacy. Yeah, a confederal. All right, that's what he wants to see in Europe. Now, on the other side is a person by the name of Altiero Spinelli. There's his photo. And he's much different than Churchill. He's a big federalist. He's an Italian federalist. And he creates a plan to make a federal United States of Europe. He says that's the only way to keep the peace. A confederal Europe, it will not make peace and stability. Only a federal Europe, a real United States. Think of the USA today. The USA is not confederal. It's a federal country with the big power in Washington. That's what he wants for Europe, the Spinelli, okay? So what did they do? Well, they have a meeting in 1948 called the Congress of Europe. And this is in The Hague, Netherlands. And there are 75 participants from all over Europe, all over the European countries. They're sending representatives. And the big question, students, now, and please remember, this is a very important Congress. Remember, 1948 Congress of Europe. The big question is, what type of Europe do we want? Do we want a confederal Europe, like Winston Churchill believes? Or do we want a federal Europe, like Spinelli would like? what type of Europe do we really, really want? That's the big question of this Congress of Europe. And what did they decide in 1949? Well, they decide for a confederal Europe, what Winston Churchill wants. By the way, Winston Churchill was I believe he was the president of that Congress of Europe, the meeting, or he presided over that meeting. Yeah. So that was a big role that was a big win for Winston Churchill. He won. And in 1949, they created this first European organization called the Council of Europe, and they put it in Strasbourg, France. In Strasbourg, France. Now, students, this is not the European Union. This is a separate organization. It still exists today in Strasbourg. And the main idea of this organization today, it is an organization that monitors democracy, liberalism, and human rights among European states. It's an organization largely focused on democracy, liberalism, and human rights. But it was a big disappointment for the federalists who wanted a federal Europe. They didn't want this Council of Europe only. They wanted a real integration of Europe, not a confederal Europe, but a federal Europe. Yeah. So Spinelli was very disappointed in this 1949 Council of Europe. Now let's go back to the United States. The role of the United States in motivating European integration at this time was really big, both inspirationally, inspiring, and practically, objectively. So let's have a look at the United States here. First of all, we can say on the side of inspiration, there is no doubt that the founders of European integration, of the European Union we have today, were great admirers of the Americans and the United States. In fact, they often spoke about a United States of Europe, but in a federal way. And the big name, students, to remember here is Jean Monnet. Like Spinelli, Jean Monnet is a European federalist. He wants a federal Europe. He does not want only a confederal Europe, but a federal Europe. And interesting about Monnet, he spent a lot of time in America, and he really liked the American political system, especially the great thinkers of the architects of the United States, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, these types of people. Jean Monnet really, really respected them and liked them and wanted to use the American model as a model for Europe. If you have a chance, you can read Jean Monnet's autobiography, his memoirs, and he talks a lot about his respect for the United States. There was another European, Walter Hallstein, you can remember the name, and he was again one of the great European architects of what today we have European Union. He was a federalist. He was very impressed by the United States. He had a special interest in American history between American independence from the Great Britain in 1776 and until the U.S. Constitution in 1788. He wanted a federal Europe also, like Monnet and Spinelli. Hey, Walter Hallstein. Some of the, students, you should kind of remember these big names, okay? Because it's kind of important to remember the big names that started this European Union process, this European integration process. There he is, Walter Hallstein. In practical terms, beside the Marshall Plan money and the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the United States motivated European integration in the United States Congress with declaration of support for European integration and approving the Schuman Plan. Now, what was the Schuman Plan? It was a European proposal for a federal, or a kind of what we have today, a European Union that's going in a more federal direction. That was the Schuman Plan. Okay? That was the plan for what we really have today, the European Union. And the US Congress supported this, greatly supported this in the 1940s, this idea of a Schuman Plan with a very integrated Europe, much more integrated than the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. Okay? Students, please stop me anywhere and ask a question if you'd like at any time. Feel free to ask a question, or you can wait until the end if you like. Now, the United States believed that a united Europe, like a United States of America, was best for peace and prosperity and happiness in Europe. That's the best solution. So the Americans put the full power of America behind this idea of a united Europe, United States of Europe. Would there be a European Union today if there was no United States motivation and no United States money? That's a good question. I don't know. I think probably, but it would be much more primitive than we have today, or it would start much later than it would maybe start in the 1960s or 70s, you know. So America gave this very early push, yeah. Two of the largest American supporters of the United States of Europe were these two men. It was a U.S. Senator, William Fulbright. Students, you may know the Fulbright program. It's a scholarship and fellowship program for students and professors, for teachers in the United States. If you have a Fulbright grant, you can study in America. They still have it. You can go get information on that by consulting the American Embassy in Kyiv. You can go, contact Kyiv for the Fulbright program. That is this guy here on the left, William J. Fulbright. He was a big supporter of European integration, a U.S. senator. And the other one was the U.S. foreign minister at that time, and this is 1940s, George Marshall, very famous name. He started the Marshall Plan, the big money to support Central European countries. Okay, these are two big names in European integration history. Now, students, what is the result of all of this inspiration and all of this motivation? It's 1950, May 9th, Schuman Declaration. Now, what was the Schuman Declaration? Well, first of all, it was a press conference in Paris. And the famous date, you should try to remember this date, May 9th, 1950. May 9th, 1950, famous date, the Schuman Declaration. And these are the three main architects of the Schuman Declaration. There's Robert Schuman, or in French, Robert Schuman. Yeah, he's the French foreign minister, formerly French prime minister, but he's French foreign minister. He proposes this plan. There's Jean Monnet, who was the main architect of the plan, the main writer of the plan. Jean Monnet is a French economist who was very active at the end of World War II in French economic planning, the governmental planning to reconstruct France. That's Jean Monnet. He's interesting. He came from the Cognac region of France, and his family was in the cognac business. If you like, I don't know if you drink cognac, very strong alcohol, yeah. And then there's Konrad Adenauer, who was an anti-Nazi. He was the mayor of the city of Köln during the time of Hitler, when Hitler made him leave as mayor, and he became resistant to Hitler. And he is from this area called the Rhineland, And what is interesting about the Rhineland, it's a region of coal and steel. So he understood very well politics of coal and steel. By the way, Robert Schumann was from Alsace region of France, and that is also coal and steel region. Yeah. So you have these two people, Schumann and Adenauer. They are politicians. Schumann is the French foreign minister. Adenauer is the new prime minister of West Germany. Yeah. And they both have experience in coal and steel. And then you have economic planner Jean Monnet, who makes this Schuman plan. Well, what was the Schuman plan? Well, look at the last one, a supranational functional European community of coal and steel. Students, this is the beginning of the European Union we have today. It was very limited. It was only about countries cooperating and integrating in the area of coal and steel. Okay, that's the first community of this European Union process. It was called the European Coal and Steel Community. And why was this so special? Well, it was special because it was very federal. It was not confederal. It was, there's another word that we use in Europe for federal, supranational. It goes above the nations, above the states, the member states, to Brussels. Brussels has the authority in coal and steel. This was the Schuman plan. Now, why did they start with coal and steel? Well, if you're going to construct Europe after the war, coal and steel are critical elements. You must products. You must cooperate with coal and steel. Also, it was a way for the French to control Germany, because we don't want another problem with Germany. If Germany has its own coal and steel without an integration with other countries, it's going to be a problem, because Germany, maybe they will use this coal and steel to reactivate their army, their military. So it was a way to push Germany down and keep France and the other countries up. So here are the three big heroes of this European Union legacy. Robert Schuman on the left, French foreign minister from Alsace region of France, coal and steel. Jean Monnet, the French economic planner, the architect of the Schuman Plan, and Konrad Adenauer from the Rhineland, who understands coal and steel and is the first German prime minister. So these are the three. Now, what about Spinelli? Spinelli was not one of these architects. Spinelli was too far left. He was a former communist, Spinelli. So he was not included in this planning, but certainly he influenced this idea of a federal Europe. Now, interesting, according to some analysts, was that all three of these men, Schuman, Monnet, and Adenauer, were very strong Catholics. And many people believe that one of the motivations of these three men was their religion, because the Catholic Church teaches about cooperation, community, right? Coming together in community. Think of like a religious community, like the Franciscans or the Jesuits or something like that. So some people believe that that was also motivating Schumann, Monet, and Adenauer, their religion. That was especially true of Schumann, I think. Schumann was really very religious. And in fact, did you know, students, let's just go back, that the Vatican is considering the canonization of Robert Schumann. That maybe in the future he will be Saint Robert Schumann. That's possible. Because he was such a very strong Catholic and very strong promoter of European stability and peace. Now, what were the basic ideas here of this community? Well, the value and dignity of all people. Yeah, again, coming out of the Catholic idea. The idea of a community, this Catholic idea. And the idea of subsidiarity. Students, you're going to be hearing a lot about this word subsidiarity. It basically means, yes, Brussels has the authority in kind of a federal context. But if there is a question about coal and steel that is not, and Brussels has no authority on that question, the question will go to the states, to the member states to decide, to the lowest political authority. That's called subsidiarity. That comes also from the United States. Think about it, students. In the United States, Washington, D.C. Has authority in foreign policy. Washington, D.C. has authority over all the states in defense policy, in economic policy, but not in education. When you talk about education, that is an area of authority that goes to the states, to California, to Illinois, to Ohio, to Florida, to Texas. They decide about their own educational systems. Yeah, that's subsidiary. So if there's no authority at the top level, the authority de facto, automatically it goes to the lowest level of political authority, which is typically member states. So please remember that big word in the European Union today, subsidiarity. Okay, now so let's continue then. In 1951 and 52, we have the Treaty of Paris, which makes the European Coal and Steel Community, or the ECSC. So if you remember, we have the Schuman Declaration announcing the Coal and Steel Community, and we finally have a Treaty of Paris. Now, 1951, they signed the treaty. 1952, the treaty becomes active, right? That's why we have two dates, usually, with the treaties. When do they sign it? And when does the treaty become active? Okay, that's the European Coal and Steel Community becomes a reality. Now, in 1955, and let me just say, how many countries joined this coal and steel community? Well, 6. 6 countries started this European integration process. That now today we have 27 countries of the European Union. The original here is 6. We have France and Germany, we have Italy, and we have the Benelux country, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So please remember the original 6 countries, okay? Now we have, in 1955, a conference in Sicily called the Messina Conference. That's the name of the city in Sicily. And what do they propose? Well, there's a Benelux proposal, and they propose, let's make 2 more federal communities, 2 more supranational communities. And they do. And they do it with 2 treaties, Treaty of Rome number 1 and Treaty of Rome number 2. The first treaty is the European Atomic Energy Community Treaty. That's Treaty of Rome number 1. It's called the Euratom. Students, this has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. This is about the use of atomic energy for peaceful purpose, and for energy, yeah, and for economics, yeah, and sharing research and technology. It still exists today. The Euratom, it's part of the European Union today. And then the second Treaty of Rome was the European Economic Community, the EEC. Students, this is the big one. The EEC. Please remember this one, because this becomes the most important for many, many years. And what is this one about? This one is about economic cooperation among the 6. Now remember, we still have only 6 member states. Economic cooperation not only in coal and steel, but in all other or many other product areas, economic product areas, okay? Including agriculture in the future. They want to cooperate in agriculture, okay? That comes a little bit later, but it's in the treaty, the European Economic Community Treaty, the EEC, that expands the coal and steel community. So students, what do we have here? By 1958, we have 3 separate communities. We have the European Coal and Steel Community that is focused on coal and steel cooperation. We have the European Atomic Energy Community that is focused on atomic energy cooperation. And we have the European Economic Community that is focused on many other product areas cooperation. So at this time, we talk not about the European community, but European communities, 3 separate communities, all based in Brussels, and all having similar institutions. What are the institutions of these communities? Well, there's a high authority. Today we call that a commission. There's an assembly. Today we call that the parliament. There's a council of ministers. Today we still call that the council of ministers. And there's a court of justice. Yeah. So yeah, they have all these institutions so early. Yeah. In the process, these 3 separate communities, yeah, with 3 sets of institutions. So here it is in Ukrainian language a little bit. And I'm watching the clock here, so don't worry, we will have certainly enough time. If I don't finish everything, we'll finish this lecture in the next hour after our break. Okay, so don't worry about that. We'll continue here until 10:50. Okay. Now, what about by 1960? A new organization is created in Europe. Another organization, students. This is not sponsored by France and Germany. This is completely separate from the 3 communities that were created. It's called the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. Now, what is this? Well, let me explain a little bit. The British did not join the 3 communities. The British said, oh no, we don't want to join the coal and steel community. We don't want to join the atomic energy community. And we certainly don't want to join this big European economic community. But by 1960, the British realized they made a mistake. Those 3 communities were very successful in uniting Europe, but students, in an economically successful way, with great increase in national wealth. It was very successful in terms of money. So I think the British realized they made a mistake by not joining in the 1950s those 3 communities. Now, why didn't the British join? Well, you know, the British are always British. Many British, they think, well, we're not Americans and we're not really Europeans. We're British. You know, we are separate. We have special status, yeah, and they always like to keep their independence, which is why they did Brexit a few years ago. You know, that's why they left the European Union, because of this idea of independence and sovereignty. They want to be in control of their own political and economic system. But by 1960, maybe we made a mistake. So the British sponsor their own European organization. They call it the EFTA, and they sign a treaty in Stockholm with the countries of Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland, countries that did not join the three European communities. They join now with the British in the EFTA. And by the way, students, the EFTA still exists today. It still exists. It's very small, just a few countries in there. I think, I'm not sure exactly. I think Switzerland is in there today, Norway and Liechtenstein. So that's and the British. But I think nobody more. Maybe the British are not there. I have to check that. But you can Google that. European Free Trade Association. But it was not nearly as successful as the EEC. That was the really successful community. So in 1961, the British, when I say Britain, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Ireland applied to join the EEC. Austria, Sweden, and Switzerland apply for partner membership. Now, why partner or associate membership? Well, because remember, after the Second World War, Austria, Sweden, and Switzerland are neutral countries. So they can't directly join the European communities, but they can cooperate with them in what we call associate membership or partnership. In 1962, Norway applies to join the EEC, and Malta, Portugal, and Spain apply for associate or partner membership in the EEC. Interesting, yeah. So here's a little bit in Ukrainian. Okay, just a few more minutes before we make our break here. And I'm sure your professor will have this lecture available for you. It's being recorded, I think, so you'll have this lecture. So if you don't have all the information written, you will certainly have that. In 1962, students, the EEC finally realized the Common Agricultural Policy. Some people call it the CAP. Now, this is really, really important to know this, because the Common Agricultural Policy of the EEC, the European Economic Community, becomes the most important policy of this European integration process. We'll talk more about that later. In 1963, excuse me, France vetoes Britain, Denmark, and Ireland EEC application. Now, why? Why does France veto this? First of all, let me say that Denmark and Ireland, they make their application together with the United Kingdom. So when the United Kingdom application is vetoed, Denmark and Ireland are also automatically also vetoed. Well, the president of France at this time is Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle was relatively anti-British. He did not want the British in these European communities. Why? Well, we don't know exactly, but we can speculate. Number one, the British and the Americans really kind of pushed de Gaulle out of the wartime conferences. If you look at the Yalta Conference, or you look at the Tehran Conference, or the Casablanca Conference, all the big wartime conferences, who do you see in the photo? President Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. you do not see Charles de Gaulle. He was pushed out, maybe by the British, and he never forgot about that. So, but probably, students, a more practical reason why he vetoed, he did not want the United Kingdom dominating this EEC, this European Economic Community. If the British will join it, Britain is a relatively large country with its economy and its power. It would maybe dominate. And he wanted France to dominate these European communities, not the British. That's probably more the practical reason. Students, in 1965-67, we have a new treaty, the Merger Treaty. And what the Merger Treaty, it merges or brings together the three European communities. What are the three? Coal and Steel Community, Atomic Energy Community, and European Economic Community. Those three become one community called the European Community, or EC. That's the Merger Treaty. Now, why did they do that? Well, remember, you had three communities with three sets of institutions, and it was a little bit crazy. Why not bring them together? And so they did in Brussels. They were already in Brussels, but they just merged them into one European community. So starting in 1967, we can talk about a European community, no longer three separate communities. In 1967, the United Kingdom applies for the second time to join this community. I should put there now the EC, and the second time it's vetoed by France. Charles de Gaulle, no British, no UK in the organization. Okay, just one or two more minutes here and I'll finish. Just quickly here in Ukraine language. Okay, so we'll continue then. Just a couple more slides here, I think. Now, in 1968, students, this European community, they create a customs union. Now, remember, we still have only 6 countries there. There's 6 countries. Remember, we have France, we have Germany, we have Italy, and we have the Benelux. That's all. Still until 1968, 69, yeah? And around them now, around this European community, they make an external tariff or tax. So when the Americans want to import, or from Mexico import, or Canada, or another, Japan, they must pay taxes on the border. It's a customs union. 1969, there's a conference in The Hague. The European community has a conference. What do they discuss? Monetary union. Let's make the euro. Yeah, what becomes the euro? Number 2, Britain, Denmark, Ireland apply for the 3rd time to come into the community. And European political cooperation. What does that mean? It's a foreign policy. Foreign policy to cooperate with the foreign ministers. They call it European political cooperation. It really means cooperating in foreign policy. Okay, that's what's discussed at this Hague conference. Okay, very big conference to remember. And so what happens? In 1972, Norway, and by the way, Norway was invited to join the EC. They say no. Why do they say no? They gave a referenda to the people of Norway. And the people said, no, we don't want to join the EC. Why? Well, Norway have pretty good economy. And they decide to stay independent, to stay out. Look at this, students. 1973, Britain, Denmark, and Ireland finally join the EC. That's a big year. Why? Charles de Gaulle is gone. He's no longer president. In fact, maybe he died by that time. I have to check, but he's no longer the president of France. In 1974-75, something called the European Council is created, with the heads of all the governments meeting, from time to time. We'll talk about that. 1979, they make progress, creating a European monetary system to prepare for the euro. We'll talk about that, European monetary system to prepare later for a euro. And in 1979, they create the European Parliament, where European citizens can directly vote for members of the European Parliament. Okay, students, I'm going to stop here just before we come to 1980. And I just ask if you have any questions, if anybody would like to ask a question now, I'll be happy to take your question. Or if not, we can take our break now.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for first lecture. It was quite interesting and informative.